Welcome students to the last part of First Flies Chapter 2, Nelson Mandela, A Long Walk to Freedom. So let's begin. I'll read on page 21, last para. In life, every man has twin obligations. Obligations to his family, to his parents, to his wife and children. And he has an obligation to his people, his community, his country. So the para that we are reading talks about twin obligations. Obligations means duties or responsibilities. Nelson Mandela talks about these twin or two obligations that each person has to fulfill. The first obligation or duty is towards his family. And who all are in the family? Parents, wife, children. And then he goes on to say the other obligation is towards his country, his community, his people. So these are the twin obligations Nelson Mandela is talking about. In a civil and humane society, each man is able to fulfill those obligations according to his own inclinations and abilities. So in a civil and humane society where he finds humanity, in such an atmosphere, a man is able to fulfill his obligations towards his people and towards his family according to his own inclinations and abilities. Inclination, the meaning of inclination is given in a textbook as natural tendency of behavior. According to his natural tendencies and according to his abilities, each man is able to fulfill these two obligations in a civil and human society. Then he uses the word but. But in a country like South Africa, it was almost impossible for a man of my birth and color to fulfill both of those obligations. Then he goes on to say but. That means he was unable to fulfill these obligations towards his family and country in a country like South Africa. And it was restricted only to the people of his birth and color. We call them as colored people, colored Africans. So they were not allowed to fulfill this obligation in his country. In South Africa, a man of color who attempted to live as a human being was punished and isolated. So he goes on to say, in a country like South Africa, in his own land, a man of his color, a colored African, if he even tries to fulfill these obligations, he was punished as if he has done a crime. He was punished and isolated. Now, nowadays we are listening to this word of isolation. If a person contracts COVID-19, this virus, that person is isolated. What is the meaning of isolated? To take that person away from families, from homes, and to keep in a separate place. Separation, segregation is isolation. So when in South Africa, when a man of his color or a colored African, when he tried to fulfill his obligations, they were punished and isolated. In South Africa, a man who tried to fulfill his duty to his people was inevitably ripped from his family and his home and was forced to live a life apart. As we all know that this is the biography of Nelson Mandela, and he tells here in South Africa, if a man even tries to fulfill these obligations, what would happen to such a person? That person was inevitably, inevitably is an adverb, and it comes from the word inevitable. Inevitable means which cannot be avoided, unavoidable, was inevitably ripped from his family. Rip, the meaning of rip is to tear away. So this person was ripped away, torn apart from his own family and was forced to live a life alone or in isolation. He was forced to live a life in isolation because he tried to fulfill his obligations towards his family and country. We'll continue. To live a life apart, a twilight existence of secrecy and rebellion. Now this phrase, entire phrase, a twilight existence. Twilight is a time of the day between daylight and darkness. It may be after sunset or it may be before sunrise. That is twilight. Twilight existence. Now these people, the colored Africans, were considered as rebels. The colored people were not allowed to live freely. They were bound by laws. And if they tried to live freely, they were considered as rebellious. They were considered as rebels. So he says, and such people were either had to live a life in a dark forest hiding from government forces or were in prison. So because they could be killed at any time. That's why their life had become a twilight existence, an existence to live in dark, right? And of secrecy and rebellion, a life of a secret life where the government forces could not spot them. That's why he says, the life, the people who tried to fulfill their obligations towards his people were ripped from his family and they were forced to live a twilight existence of secrecy and rebellion. I did not in the beginning choose to place my people above my family, but in attempting to serve my people, I found that I was prevented from fulfilling my obligations as a son, a brother, a father, and a husband. In the beginning, he never chose to fulfill his duties toward his people. He never placed his people above his family. But when he tried to serve his people, he was prevented. He was not allowed to fulfill his duties towards his family. Only because he tried to serve his people. We'll continue the next para now. Now, the next para that we are going to read tells about the childhood freedom that Nelson had enjoyed. I was not born with a hunger to be free. I was born free, free in every way that I could know. Free to run in the fields near my mother's hut, free to swim in the clear stream that ran through my village, free to roast mealies under the stars and ride the broad backs of slow-moving bulls. Now he goes on in this para, he says that when he was born, he didn't born with a hunger for freedom. He was born as a free human being. What kind of freedom he speaks about? Freedom to run in the fields, freedom to swim in the clear stream, the stream that used to run through Nelson's village, and to roast mealies. That's a South African word for sweet corn. So Nelson says that when he was a child, he used to do all these things, like running in the fields near his mother's hut, then playing or swimming in the clear stream water, the stream that ran through Nelson's village, and at night to roast mealies over the fire and ride the broad backs of slow moving bulls. Every child that lives in an open country enjoys all this freedom. As long as I obeyed my father and abided by the customs of my tribe, I was not troubled by the laws of man or God. So as a child, as long as he was a child, and as long as he obeyed his father. Now, some sources said that Nelson lost his father at the age of 12. So he says that as long as I obeyed my father, that is, as long as he obeyed his father, as long as he was in his tribe, obeyed the customs of his tribe, no other laws, maybe the laws of the country or laws of God, never bothered him. So this is about the freedom that Nelson had enjoyed in his childhood. Let's move on to the next para. The para talks about hunger for freedom. Now the next para that we're going to read talks about how this hunger for freedom came into being. It was only when I began to learn that my boyhood freedom was an illusion. Illusion, the meaning of illusion is you see something to be real, but that is not real, it's fake. Okay, illusion is the meaning given in your textbook is something that appears to be real, but it is not. You see something and you believe it's real, but it's not real, it's fake. Example, hallucination. So illusion. So he says, it was only when I learned, as he started growing, when he started becoming a young man, he learned that he understood that whatever freedom that he had enjoyed in his childhood was an illusion, was not real, was not as it seemed to be. Illusion. When I discovered as a young man that my freedom had already been taken from me, that I began to hunger for it. Why did Nelson began to hunger for freedom? When he realized that his childhood freedom was an illusion, was fake, was not real as he thought to be. And the second thing is, when he became a young man, he understood that his freedom had already been taken away by someone. He is not at all free. And that's the reason he started hungering for freedom. At first, as a student, I wanted freedom only for myself. The transitory freedoms of being able to stay out at night, read what I pleased, and go where I choose. So at the beginning stage, he wanted freedom only for himself as a young man, to do whatever he wanted to please. He wanted for himself. He wanted freedom only for himself. The transitory freedom. Transitory means temporary, not permanent. Freedom to stay out at night, read whatever he want, go wherever he want. Such type of freedom he started hungering for. Later, as a young man in Johannesburg, I yearned for the basic and honorable freedoms of achieving my potential, of earning my keep, of marrying and having a family, the freedom not to be obstructed in a lawful life. So then, as a young man in Johannesburg, there he started to yearn, to desire intensely for basic and honorable freedom, for basic freedom as a young man. First, he wanted to achieve his potential. Potential is an ability to succeed, to achieve something in life. So he wanted this basic freedom to achieve his potential, of earning my keep. Earning my keep is a phrase. To earn your keep, this phrase means to pay for the things that you need by earning money or by working for the people that you live with. That's the phrase, to earn my keep. So here, Nelson started yearning for this basic freedom, to earn money, and with that money to buy things that he needs, daily requirements. He didn't have that. Then the next freedom he wanted of marrying and having a family. As a young man, he wanted to marry and have a family. And the freedom not to be obstructed to stop, barriers, to live a lawful life. He wanted to live a life permitted by the law and not obstructed by anything. All this basic and honorable freedom Nelson Mandela yearned for. So this para talks about the hunger for freedom, what happened when he started growing up, and when he learned that his freedom had already taken away. Let's move on to the next para. And then I slowly saw that not only was I not free, but my brothers and sisters were not free. I saw that it was not just my freedom that was curtailed, but the freedom of everyone who looked like I did. Then slowly he started understanding that not only he was not free, but every person that looks like him, that belonged to his color, were not free. Everyone's freedom was curtailed, stopped, or cancelled. They were not allowed to live freely. That is when I joined the African National Congress, and that is when the hunger for my own freedom became the greater hunger for the freedom of my people. Now he says that was a reason when he learned that every person who belonged to his color, all the colored Africans, didn't have freedom. So here we come to know why Nelson joined the African National Congress. When he learned that every person that belonged to his color was deprived of freedom, who didn't have even the basic and honorable freedom. This led him to join African National Congress. And that is when his hunger, the hunger for freedom, became greater. Now, this hunger for freedom was not limited for himself, but it was for his people too. And that's why that hunger he calls as greater hunger, because it was not only for himself, but for his entire race. It was this desire for the freedom of my people to live their lives with dignity and self-respect that animated my life. Now, here it was this desire for the freedom of my people. He wanted his people to live with dignity and self-respect. What do you mean by dignity? Dignity means to be worthy of respect. He wanted his people to live with dignity and self-respect. Self-respect means holding yourself in esteem and believing that you are worthy of respect, that you are good and worthy of being treated well. That is self-respect. So Nelson's goal was now that his people should live with dignity, because even they were worthy of respect and self-respect. And this desire animated his life. Animated means full of action, lively. This desire transformed him. Let's see the transformation here. That transformed a frightened young man into a bold one. That drove a law-abiding attorney to become a criminal. That turned a family-loving husband into a man without a home. That forced a life-loving man to live like a monk. Now, what transformation was born into his life when he started hungering for freedom? So he was frightened. He lived like a frightened young man. But this hunger of freedom had turned this frightened young man into a bold one. Once he was a law-abiding attorney. He was a lawyer. He had studied law. He used to live a life abiding by the laws. But now this desire for freedom for his people had turned this attorney into a criminal. That turned a family-loving husband into a man without family. So he had to live in secrecy. We saw a twilight existence of secrecy and rebellion. So all this turned his life upside down. He loved his family, but now he was forced to live like a man without a home, or a homeless man. That forced a life-loving man to live like a monk. A monk is a religious person who forbids all the worldly pleasures and lives in a monastery. That's a monk. So here he says that because of all these changes in his life, he was a life-loving man, but now he has changed or transformed into a monk. He didn't become a monk willingly, not really a monk. The meaning here is he was forced to live like a monk, without family, without friends. Let's move on. I am no more now. The sentence from that transformed a frightened young man into a bold one. You see the contrast here. Frightened, bold. Law-abiding attorney, criminal. Family-loving husband, man without home. These are all juxtaposition. The figure of speech here is juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a literary technique or device in which two elements, two or more ideas, places, characters, and their actions are placed side by side in a narrative or a poem for the purpose of developing comparisons and contrast. That is juxtaposition. In our text, the ideas are placed in a line, in a sentence. They are placed together to create a contrast, and this is what we call as juxtaposition literary device. Let's move on. I am no more virtuous or self-sacrificing than the next man. That means I'm equal to the next man. I don't have special abilities. I'll read again. I am no more virtuous or self-sacrificing than the next man. But I found that I could not even enjoy the poor and limited freedoms I was allowed when I knew my people were not free. He goes on to say that he didn't enjoy even the smallest freedom as a human being. And he saw that even his people were not allowed to enjoy these small freedoms. Freedom is indivisible. Now, what do you mean by indivisible? A number that cannot be divided further, right? Indivisible. Now here he says freedom is indivisible. What is the meaning? Freedom is the ability to choose and make one's own decision. It cannot be quantified. Everyone is born free, and freedom is the birthright of every human being. Freedom is not something that you have to earn for or you need to acquire. That's why he says freedom is indivisible. You cannot divide freedom into small parts. You cannot divide freedom into fractions. That's why he says freedom is indivisible. Then he goes on to say, the chains on any one of my people were the chains on all of them. The chains on any one of my people. If one person is not free, then the entire race is not free. The chains on all of my people were the chains on me. What are these chains? These chains means the chains of apartheid, bondage, all these bondage. If one person is not free, then these chains were on all the people, on the entire race. And if these chains are on all the people, then he says these chains were on me also. Chains always restrict movement. So all these that he has gone through, he describes them as chains because they had no freedom to live as a human being. Now here, the chains on any one of my people were the chains on all is imagery. The writer wants to create an effect. So when you read that, so you can see images coming in your mind. That's imagery. Let's move on. I knew that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. Oppressor and oppressed. The person who oppresses others is called the oppressor. And the person who is a victim, who takes the oppression, that is the person who is oppressed. So Nelson here says both these parties, the oppressor and the oppressed, both of them need freedom. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. Now he goes on to explain that the person, the oppressor, the person who takes other man's freedom from that person, a person who snatches other person's freedom, that person himself is a prisoner of hatred. That person is full of hate, and because of that, he is oppressing others. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. Now he goes on to say, such a person, an oppressor who is a prisoner of hatred, is locked behind the bars of prejudice. What is prejudice? A prejudice is an unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without knowledge, thought, or reason. An opinion or feeling that doesn't have any basis. You simply hate someone because you don't like someone. That's prejudice. And unreasonable feelings, opinions, or attitudes, especially of a hostile nature, regarding an ethnic, racial, social, or religious group. There is prejudice. So he says, such a man is a prisoner of hatred, and he is locked behind the bars of prejudice. He doesn't know the fact, the basis. All his feelings of hatred are unreasonable. And he is narrow-minded. A narrow-minded person will not listen to others' opinion. And he will not tolerate other people's view. That is narrow-minded. A narrow-minded person doesn't want to change. He wants to abide in his own principles. Such a man is called as narrow-minded. Now here, prisoner of hatred, bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness, these are metaphors. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. Both the person, if a person takes away others' freedom, if the person brings a person under chains, that person is not free, and the person on whom restrictions are put, that person also is not free. So both the parties are not free according to Nelson Mandela. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. So he says both the oppressor and the oppressed are robbed of their humanity. What are the factors of a humanity? Kindness, loving. These things are not there, then that person is robbed of it. He has lost that. Okay, so here our lesson ends, and I hope you understood.